Hey everyone, welcome to the Mark Prater podcast, where our aim is to connect our global family of Sovereign Grace churches with our executive director. Mark, people who check out our podcast may remember back a little ways, you talked about how it's important for us in Sovereign Grace churches to be willing to have hard conversations. Frank, straightforward, difficult conversations are necessary. And because you carry us on your heart and you have a burden for the health of our pastoral teams and our churches, you want to revisit that topic.
I do. I want to revisit it because thank you for saying that's my heart, because that's my heart, Ben, to see us continue to grow in Christ as pastors and as members of our churches, but also
Mhm.
to pursue the building of healthy churches. And I think hard conversations, having gracious, loving, difficult conversations, is a part of building towards health in a church. And I still see a need of that for
Mhm.
that in Sovereign Grace, for us to grow in this area of having those difficult conversations, interacting with pastors and pastoral teams, and even members of our churches. I think it's still a weakness for us that we need to
Mm.
grow in. And I came upon a section of a lecture that Charles Spurgeon gave to his pastor's college students. It's
Mm.
a chapter in his book, Lectures to My Students, and it's entitled, the lecture is entitled, the Necessity of Ministerial Progress.
Mm.
And obviously he's drawing upon 1 Timothy 4:15, where Paul's
Right.
writing to Timothy saying, may all see your progress.
Mm.
And what he's talking about there is Timothy providing a godly example in the church and continue to grow in godliness and integrity before the people. And they need to see a pastor's progress in that area.
Mm.
So he's got a whole section in this lecture that really he talks about difficult conversations. And I just want to read the first section to you. He says this: may you also possess the grand moral characteristic of courage.
Mm.
By this, we do not mean impertinence, impudence, or self-conceit. You're not rude, you're not proud, is what he's
Yep.
saying, but real courage to do and say calmly the right thing, and to go straight on to all hazards, though there should be none that give you a good word. Um, and then he says this: I'm astonished at the number of Christians who are afraid to speak the truth to their brethren.
Mm.
And so he saw the same need at Metropolitan Tabernacle and in the churches he worked with that we see in Sovereign Grace for us to grow in this area. But it's interesting the way he framed it there. He said, possess the grand moral characteristic of courage. And so he's making an attachment to morality and courage there in an interesting way. And it got
Yeah.
me thinking, what is that true? And I think it is. You know, God can obviously work in us to inspire courage, but for us to be courageous, there is a moral component to it that I think is the effect of the gospel transforming us. And I think a good biblical passage to go to is actually Galatians 2. I think it's 11 through 14, where Paul had this very difficult conversation with Peter. He
Mm.
called Peter out basically for identifying with the circumcision group in a way that was hypocritical,
Right.
and he wasn't acting on his true convictions. And it concerned Paul not only for Peter, but he goes on to say your hypocrisy had affected Barnabas as well.
Mm.
And so there's a moral component there that is based on your conviction of truth. We're not going to be hypocritical. We're
Mm.
going to stand for the real gospel, not gospel plus circumcision in this case. And he needed to speak truth because he was not only concerned about Peter, he was concerned about Barnabas. And those men are leaders. And if they're affecting a church, their influence will affect the church, then that's an issue. So there's this conviction of God's truth found in his word that you have the moral courage to speak
Mm.
so that it serves the church is what I think he means by this grand moral characteristic of courage.
That's excellent. I think that is a word that pastors and members of churches need to hear regularly. We are to cultivate courage, godly courage, and like he said, and you're saying, this is not about being quarrelsome or pugnacious or harsh at all. Um, Rather, there's a great kindness in it when
Yes.
done in a godly way. So why is it so important for us in Sovereign Grace to be willing to have these hard conversations?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons. Let me just, before I give you those reasons, just read one more section from
Mm.
Spurgeon. And it kind of gets at this a little bit why it's important. He says, under God, that's important right there. God's watching, right? Under
Right.
God, I owe my position in my own church to the absence of all policy. So it doesn't make any difference about policy and the habit of saying what I mean. In other words, speak truth. The plan of making things pleasant all around is a perilous as well as a wicked one. In other
Mm.
words, if you're just wanting everything to be pleasant and everybody to be happy, that's going to get you in a lot of trouble. And that's not what you're called to do before God. That's why it's important,
Yeah.
obviously, as a pastor and as a leader, but I think even as a Christian brother or sister speaking to one another.
Mm.
Again, assuming that you do it in a gracious, loving, godly way, as you mentioned. And then he says this: above all things, avoid cowardice, for it makes men liars. If you have anything that you feel you ought to say about a man, let the measure of what you say be this: how much dare I say to his face? You must not allow yourselves a word more in censure of any man living. If that be your rule, your courage will save you from 1,000 difficulties
Mm.
and win you lasting respect. And I think that's so true. I said this in a previous episode. Hard conversations save us from 1,000 difficulties, as Spurgeon says so well. And in having those conversations, as you mentioned a moment ago, Ben, you actually serve others
Mm.
who need to hear them and will be grateful for them, especially if they're godly men and women, which I believe a lot of our folks in our churches are. Most of our folks are. But in doing so, you also serve the church.
Yeah.
You serve your pastoral team, and when you, in a very godly way, humble way, a clear way, yet courageous way, share truth of a truth that someone needs to hear, you actually establish integrity,
Mm.
you establish your influence, and you gain their respect, as Spurgeon said. So we think having hard conversations will actually people will disrespect us. Actually,
Mm.
godly people who hear hard things and respond in a godly way, they will respect you for it. And so I think that's just a number of reasons why it's important. The good of others, the good of the church, the good of a pastoral team, but also your ability to influence others with integrity. And I believe it'll gain your respect if those hard conversations are done rightly.
Yeah, that's excellent, Mark. Appreciate that encouragement. If it's the reality is I'm confident there's some pastors that are checking out the podcast that, they're just they've been taking some hits recently. There's a lot of pressure. There's been maybe some loud voices of disagreement. Um, and the idea of, you know, getting up and going and having another hard conversation just seems like the farthest thing from what they want to do. Just real briefly, how would you encourage somebody who's struggling in that way and wanting to cultivate courage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are pastors listening to this podcast or maybe reading transcript who are in that very situation.
Yeah.
And my first thought is, brothers, thank you for being faithful.
Mm.
Thank you for taking the hits that have been difficult to hear. And maybe it's a season of that for you. I just want you to know I thank God for you because you're
Mm,
being faithful. And
yeah.
that's what God requires of stewards is that we be faithful,
Yeah.
stewards of the gospel. So I would just want to begin with just encouraging someone. You're doing what God has called you to do. You're doing the right things. It's just difficult right now.
Yeah.
Second, I would just before I try to work up any courage, I would go to Christ,
Yeah.
spend time in His Word, be with Jesus, because I find that first of all, it cares for my soul to be with Christ in His Word. It strengthens my soul. And I would encourage you to have certain passages that you could go to that would really encourage you. I don't know what to do, Lord, but my eyes are upon you.
Yeah.
Isaiah 26:3 says, you keep him in perfect peace, whose eyes are stayed upon you.
Mm,
So just drawing from the Lord Himself, who will give you courage in the moment. And then I would also do this. I would just declare my dependence upon the Spirit of God.
mm,
I've got to go have this difficult conversation. I want to do it in a godly way, in a loving way, in a pastoral way. But I'm not feeling any of that right now. But I do believe this, that your power is made perfect in my weakness. So fill me
that's
with your
good.
Spirit, grant me wisdom, grant me the words, and especially the power and courage to have this conversation in a way that serves this person and pleases you. So those
Mm.
are just some quick thoughts that come to mind.
Excellent. Well, may God continue to grow us as a family of churches in godly courage so that we can have um, difficult conversations, hard conversations that are necessary for us to be healthy in our churches and our relationships, and ultimately for the glory of God. So thank you for your encouragement, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for checking out the podcast. And we'll see you here next week, Lord willing. Bye for now.
Thank you for watching. If you have questions or comments, Mark would love to hear from you. For more videos like this, hit subscribe on YouTube or by email at markkprater.com.